I've gone through a very extensive illustration of exactly how the corruption that has been part of this government since I've been in this government, since I've been in this Parliament for 6 years now. I guess it's 5 years, but at the end of the term here it'll be 6 years. But we've gone through RCMP. We've gone, well, that was the previous Paul Martin government that fell for that, and recognize it fell over a $4 million scandal. Now, $4 million is a heck of a lot than a $400 million scandal. But the government fell in 2004, almost 20 years ago, over a $4 million scandal, where it was proven that the government had actually given money to companies where money was being funneled back to the Liberal Party. So giving money to insiders, and the Gomery Commission at the end of the day proved that that money, a lot of that money ended back up in the Liberal Party's hands. It was atrocious. Canadians punished the government for that and sent them packing and sent in a new government in 2006 for good reason. Long in the tooth and effectively paying a lot of money to their friends. Now, the Gomery Commission obviously found enough information on $4 million worth of government graft, if you will, corruption, that it acted. It acted accordingly to the way it should have. But I've spoken about this, and I've spoken about the various other scandals that have happened in this government. SNC-Lavalin, we've talked about that. That was in 2018. And what that did was effectively tarnish Canada's reputation on the international stage, because one of our, at the time, I think our largest engineering company was involved in corporate corruption around the world. That means that a lot of Canadian companies weren't able to bid on international contracts. That's a huge cost to the country. If you think about how many Canadian companies could not participate in international bids from international organizations because of one bad apple that was in the pockets of this Liberal government. And how do I know that? I know that because at the end of the day, you had the Prime Minister more or less throwing one of his ministers completely under the bus in order to get what he wanted as a deferred agreement with SNC-Lavalin, and getting the Attorney General to acquiesce to that, which was completely and deemed to be and ruled to be corrupt. Should never have happened. The Winnipeg Labs, well, we know what happened in the Winnipeg Labs. The government ended up calling an election rather than facing the consequences in front of this House of an order to produce the documents that were from the leaks from the Winnipeg Lab. Incidentally, that was in 2021 when the civil servant was at this bar in this House, Mr. Speaker, effectively saying, you know, I've got some privilege where I don't have to provide this. And your predecessor, Mr. Speaker, was ordering him. The government, what they did is they took your predecessor to court in order not to produce those documents. That's never been done before in Canadian history, where the government takes the Speaker, the representative of this Parliament, to court, legally weaponizing against this Parliament. Parliament is supreme. The government isn't supreme. This government answers to Parliament. This is our role here as elected officials, to oversee the government, not to just do what the government says. And you've been very good at that, Mr. Speaker, as far as making sure they're held to account. And I applaud your order here, getting them to actually produce these documents. Winnipeg Labs was one thing. Incidentally, I wanted to point out, 2024, the government actually produced 600 pages of documents regarding the leaks at the Winnipeg Microbiology Lab. Now, that's 3 years later than they were asked for by this Parliament. But I want to really expose the lengths the government went to avoid that. They called an election. They called an election in order to dissolve Parliament so they wouldn't have to disclose what had happened and what they were complicit in allowing to happen at one of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. It was scandalous that they got away with this. We Charity, of course, I've gone into it in detail, but We Charity was once again senior members of the government working hand in hand with their friends, money going back and forth about who's getting paid for what.
Wow.
Lots of money going back to the Liberal pockets' hands. It was scandalous, and I will say as corrupt as anything I've seen in this government. And luckily we exposed that, and I recall it was one of my first years in Parliament. and I recall bringing some of my skill set to the fore at that point in time, because I was actually looking at their financial statements and looking at one year versus the other years, and looking at it and saying, these are not right. And actually looking at we at that point in time as a charity that was actually hiding some information. An in-out scam, if there's ever was one. Arrive scam, we've gone through that in detail as well. Arrive scam was a lot of money going to two people working in the basement of their homes, money being shoveled out the door. Canadians know all about it. Again, we had him at the bar here in Parliament. We had somebody actually answering to parliamentarians about what was going on in his company and how he more or less used a lot of influence with his Liberal friends and his government friends in order to get a whole bunch of money shoveled into his bank accounts. This is corruption. This is lack of oversight. And I know that my colleagues on the other side of the House, the government side of the House, they're going, well, that's just incompetence from the government's part. Nothing to do with us here. It's just the government being incompetent. Don't tell us to be accountable. Government is supposed to be accountable. Every one of these ministers is supposed to be accountable for the departments. And the thing that was quite clear in the ruling that the Auditor General had here when they looked at the Green Slush Fund, which we're addressing here today, Mr. Speaker, was that the Minister of Industry did not oversee the contracts with the conflicted Liberal insiders at all. And I want everybody to address that here in the House of Commons. The Minister of Industry didn't oversee those contracts at all. And think about what I call the Minister of writing checks, because that's all he does. He thinks he's there to just bring in business to Canada and write billions of dollars worth of checks to all kinds of industries, many of which are long shot gambles, but this is the Canadian taxpayers' money that he's throwing out there without any accountability whatsoever. Not just accountability for the money, but accountability for the contracts, accountability for the people involved, accountability to make sure that we're getting value for money, even if the contract is a terrible contract. Does it measure up? The Minister of Industry is clearly not being accountable for that, and should be held to account in this House at the soonest possibility, Mr. Speaker. These are hundreds. This one here, let's get to the point. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars funneled to Liberals and Liberal friends through the Green Slush Fund. And all of a sudden, we're asking for those documents. The Auditor General has found some malfeasance there. The documents come back, and they're completely redacted. As my friend, the member for South Shore St. Margaret said, he could have run out of toner in the Prime Minister's office. There was so much black ink on that page. But I've spoken of various scandals here, hundreds of millions of dollars. We've spoken about a number of these issues. But let me ask this question. Is this criminal? Well, we don't know yet. We're trying to get these unredacted documents into the hands of the police so the police can determine if there are criminal charges to be laid here. And we're being held up by this government. 3 years, like the Winnipeg microbiology lab, you're going to hold it up for 3 years to try and just shovel it under the rug. Nothing happened here. Well, 3 years down the road, well, something happened, but don't worry about it. It was so long ago, we don't need to worry about it anymore. That's not the way this Parliament works. We're asking for these documents. We're Parliament. We're asking these documents to be unredacted and provided to us so we can oversee these and make sure there's accountability built into them. But I'm going to ask this question as well. If this is criminal, is what's happening in this House right now a cover-up of criminality? So I'm asking the people on that side of the House, the people on the government benches, is this a cover-up of criminality? And if so, once it's determined that this is criminal, what do you think the complicity in this is going to be looked at from the Canadian public, but also from the police? We tried to hide this evidence from Parliament, who legitimately and legally asked for this, and we decided, the government says, that we're not going to provide it in a first iteration since Confederation, where this government has repeatedly provided not enough information to this Parliament. COVID changed a lot, I admit, in this country. It wasn't supposed to change democracy or the way we handle democracy in this House of Commons. We are supposed to practice democracy as if this House of Commons holds the government accountable for their actions, especially their actions in spending Canadian taxpayer money. I have heard the House Leader, the Deputy House Leader, talk about the Charter. This is nonsense. The Charter was not designed, there's no foresight at all, to have the Charter interrupt Parliament's role in holding the government to account. That is completely made up. It is a fabrication and should not be entertained here at all. And if any official at the Department of Justice is putting that forward as an argument, put that name forward, because that person should be disbarred very quickly here and should not be practicing law in Canada, let alone for Her Majesty's government. This is, again, a ruse put forward by this government in order not to be accountable to this Parliament. This government needs to be accountable to this Parliament. Our job here, Her Majesty's loyal opposition, is to hold this government accountable, and it is doing its best to obfuscate, confuse, and try not to provide the information that's required for us to do our job here as His Majesty's loyal opposition. Mr. Speaker, I beseech you, can you please enforce this as much as you can, as you have done to this point in time. Continue to hold these people to account as we are here today. Continue to enforce your rules as the representative of Parliament, making sure that the rules in this House are upheld and this government is held to account for its abuse of taxpayer funds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire. The honourable member from Hamilton Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I listened very carefully to my friend's speech, and I'm wondering if he saw the letter from the RCMP. I saw it for the first time today. I'm not sure when it comes, but as someone who covered criminal court for many years as a journalist, I have a lot of sympathy for the RCMP who are saying even if they get these documents, which they don't want, they wouldn't be able to use them in a court of law because it doesn't follow the proper chain of evidence. And at the very end of the letter, let me quote, he says, the RCMP is operationally independent, strictly adheres to the principle of police independence. In a free and democratic society, this ensures the government cannot direct or influence the actions of law enforcement. I'm wondering what the honourable member has to say in response to the RCMP.
The honourable member from Calgary Centre.
There's a couple things the member said in that question. Number one, she saw that document today and it's been commented on for 2 weeks here, and I wonder why she hasn't looked at it sooner. But we are not the government. We are not the government. We are Parliament. They are the government. The government is the front bench over on that side of the House. That front bench is not supposed to direct the RCMP. Our role as Parliament is to hold the government to account. We are asking the government, and we've asked it, and you've ruled on it, Mr. Speaker, they need to provide those documents to the RCMP for them to determine exactly what has gone wrong here and if it is criminal. I don't know why the member on the other side doesn't see that chain of events for them to see the evidence and them to determine if there's a criminal act that occurred in there and for them to investigate that at that point in time. The first step in that process is what we do here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Calgary Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I wanted to ask a question from my colleague. I remember a time in this country when there was something called the sponsorship scandal that really rocked the political world. And actually, that's the event that made me a conservative. It was a seminal event for a lot of young conservatives. At the time, all opposition parties were united to ensure that we could fend off this massive corruption scandal coming from the Liberal Party of Canada that eventually would bring down the government. I want to ask my colleague whether he thinks that unity amongst the opposition parties will be able to hold well into the future and into the coming weeks so that we can ensure ourselves that we retain the right of Parliament unobstructed to obtain documents on behalf of Canadians so that we can get to the truth, and that we don't see the government use both the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a shield to defend their own corruption.
The honourable member from Calgary Centre.
I thank my colleague very much for the question. I did have reference to the sponsorship scandal in my speech, and I had to cut a couple pages of out to fit within the time allotted. But he's exactly right. It coalesced Canadians on how their government was actually working, and there weren't checks and balances on money going out the door from the Liberal government of the time and back in the back door of political contributions. It was obscene. It was absolutely obscene from 1996 to 2004. There was a Gomery Commission that actually looked at how all that money was backdoored into the Liberal Party, money given to Liberal friends, backdoored into the Liberal Party. It was an awful demonstration of how a democratic country should run itself. And that government got thrown out. For $4 million at the end is the amount found by the Gomery Commission, as opposed to $400 million. Now, I appreciate inflation, but inflation over 20 years is not 100 times the scandal that happened in that year. This is something that we have to make sure we're holding the government accountable and make sure the public sees that we are doing our job and that the government is actually doing providing some transparency, some accountability for its actions. Thank you very much.
L'honorable député d'Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavut.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente, là, avec le discours qui n'arrête pas depuis des jours, on a l'impression d'avoir un match qui ne finit pas. Les libéraux et les conservateurs, ils se pitchent la balle l'un et l'autre, puis on n'arrive même pas au but depuis plusieurs jours. Le scandale de TDC, c'est la preuve de la perte de contrôle sur les fonds publics d'ailleurs. Gaspillage et ingérence sont inhérents au système fédéral, Madame la Présidente. Le gouvernement peut-il être conséquent et responsable, et aussi, pouvons-nous faire enfin notre travail de législateur? Si vous êtes le gouvernement prochainement, au niveau des conservateurs, que ferez-vous pour éviter ce stratagème?
Center.
C'est une bonne question et je remercie mon collègue pour la bonne question. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Et si on est le gouvernement ici, à ce côté de la Chambre, on va travailler avec tous les intervenants et assurer que toutes les dépenses que le gouvernement fait sont comptables pour les gens du Canada et transparents. Ça, c'est quelque chose. On dit que si on remet au soleil des informations, c'est un bon nettoyeur. Merci beaucoup.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm actually disappointed in the response the member gave to my colleague. I think it's illegitimate. I've been in opposition for over 20 years. And to try to say because you're in opposition, you have supreme power, and to use that as a beating tool over constitution or charter rights, I think is shameful. The RCMP are very, very clear in terms of the game that the Conservative Party of Canada is playing. And I quote from the letter, "There is a significant risk that the motion could be interpreted as a circumvention of normal investigative processes and charter protections." This is not the government or the Liberal Party saying this. Madam Speaker, this is the RCMP institution, the commissioner. And then to say, well, it's not a charter issue, and try to downplay that issue is disgraceful. Why won't the Conservative Party stop playing the game and realize that this is something that is serious and stop the filibuster and allow the issue to go to the Procedures and House Affairs Committee so we can start dealing with issues that Canadians are concerned about, not the games, the political games that the Conservative Party of Canada wants to play at a great expense to Canadians.
Member for Calgary Centre, order.
I'm responding to my colleague again, and I know that sometimes I irritate him in this respect. The issue is that we're not holding up Parliament, Madam Speaker. You know that. The order was for them to provide the documents to Parliament unredacted, and they refuse to do so. And the Speaker said that we're not going to deal with any other business of the House until this is finally dealt with. So we are awaiting those documents. Please provide those documents, and we will love to get back to doing the work of Parliament and getting some relief for Canadians that this government has stressed so badly in this process. I'm looking forward to those documents and getting back to work for Canadians.
Durant la période de questions, on a entendu des réponses du gouvernement disant que on ne pouvait pas donner les documents à la police, à la GRC, parce que la GRC n'avait pas émis de mandat de perquisition, alors que tout ce qu'on veut, c'est faire un dépôt de preuves potentiel. Ce n'est pas imposer une vision, ce n'est pas imposer un mandat, c'est donner des preuves potentielles et la GRC en fera ce qu'elle voudra. Et on parle aussi de la division des pouvoirs. Je viens de le dire, on n'a pas donné d'ordre à la GRC. On ne veut pas donner d'ordre de la GRC parce que la division des pouvoirs, elle est essentielle en démocratie. Alors, je me demande comment est-ce qu'il est possible que des membres du gouvernement ne fassent pas la différence, à moins que ce ne soit rien d'autre qu'une tentative de faire un écran de fumée pour empêcher la remise des documents non caviardés. J'aimerais entendre mon collègue sur ces sujets.
L'honorable député de Calgary Centre.
Merci beaucoup à mon collègue. Je suis exactement aux mêmes pensées d'elle parce que je pense qu'elle est en train de fumée qu'elle a présenté à ce chambre-ci. Ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est la vérité pour éviter les pouvoirs du Parlement ici. Je ne sais pas pourquoi ils veulent éviter les pouvoirs du Parlement, parce que le Parlement est très important pour la démocratie au Canada. Et s'il vous plaît, donnez le renseignement au Parlement pour distribuer aux gendarmes. Ça, c'est très important pour le rôle que l'opposition joue dans la Chambre des communes. C'est important de garder ça et je remercie mon collègue encore pour la question.